All right, good morning, everyone. I'll just sort of piddle along for a bit as people stream in and all of that. And it seems as though these kleptocracy initiative gatherings and events are getting more and more informal in a way, because there's sort of an inside crowd that comes, and then there are people who add themselves to this, but one recognizes more and more faces. So I just sort of have my coffee up here this morning and whatever, and we'll go through things. But so welcome to Hudson Institute, first of all, and the Kleptocracy Initiative has been here for 3.5 years now, and we're very happy here. And Hudson is, in the annual report, you'll see a spiel and this, that, and the other. But what I think distinguishes us from some of the other center-right think tanks in Washington is that we are very explicitly for global engagement. And that separates us certainly from some of our colleague institutions in some ways. And we also live under the shadow still of the great Herman Kahn, who really built Hudson up in terms of its initial reputation and all. And we are, of course, a much more diversified, somewhat larger, and very Washington-based institution now. Now, I'm Charles Davidson, the executive director of the Kleptocracy Initiative, as in fact most of you know. And today is kind of a big deal for us, because this in some ways is maybe the most major report we have yet released, in that I would say more work, more man and woman hours went into this than anything else we've yet done. So I wanted to rifle through, and this is going to be very fast, our previous publications. They're all out there, and some of you may have known them, so that you see how we have arrived at where we are now and why we're emphasizing the topic that is the topic today of this particular study. So the first thing we put out was Cleaning Up Atlantis, How to Put a Kleptocracy on the Road to Transparency. So this is, about how do you de-kleptocratize a kleptocracy. It was an official job by Baker McKenzie. The partner Tom Firestone put this together, but with some collaboration from colleagues at Baker McKenzie. Official job on this for Hudson Institute, which is kind of interesting. The second publication by Oliver Bullough is about the 3 stages of kleptocracy. You've got to loot, then you've got to stash it somewhere, and then you have to rehabilitate, or habilitate, we really should say, your reputation and become a full-fledged yacht-owning, university-donating, very respectable, expensive cufflink-wearing member of Western society. We then published The Kleptocracy Curse, Rethinking Containment, which has Ben's name on it and the talent of Ben's pen, and then a lot of research assistant from Melinda Lee, with whom he did the thing we'll be presenting today, and our whole team. But this is something we started with Ben, actually, the summer after the Kleptocracy Initiative started, and we couldn't quite pull it all off, and then we came back to it a year later. And this is really the document, if you're going to look at one thing that sort of summarizes what we think, what we've done, and what our policy recommendations are. And the first thing we start with in terms of our recommendations and where we still are is getting rid of anonymous companies and various ways of owning assets anonymously within the West for kleptocrats, to sort of put it in elementary terms. We then published Weaponizing Kleptocracy, Putin's Hybrid Warfare by Marius Rorinavicius, who's arguably the most eminent journalist, living journalist in Lithuania, certainly of his generation. He's a little younger than me. And it's all about Putin's hybrid warfare and the corruption export kleptocracy aspect of it going way back. This isn't something new, and it's the history of that going back to the KGB, this, that, and the other. It's a very integrated sort of paper, which has been very well received. Then, something really interesting and really original that one doesn't see anywhere else, to my knowledge. And it's a very powerful idea, and I think this may be the idea that can really galvanize anti-kleptocracy beyond the journalists and think tanks and practitioners in our government who are all riled up about the kleptocracy issue. This is about how it affects all citizens, and it's about how we initially called them neo-Gulag values, but really how corrosive practices come into our societies when we welcome the money of kleptocrats, because they come themselves also, and they bring their children, and they have not become freedom-loving, democracy-promotion folks, quite the contrary. And so they bring with them their corrosive norms, culture, into our societies, and this describes this whole idea with all sorts of examples. Obviously, it doesn't mention too many names, but it's a very, very powerful series of ideas. And this has interested a lot of people in our government. I've been surprised in terms of the current debates. Then, yesterday, on the Hill, we presented the United States of Anonymity. I needn't say more, and it's by Casey Michel. Oh, I should have mentioned this corrosive practices paper was by the remarkable Ilya Zaslavsky, whom we have worked with on this, many things, and will, I hope, work with on other things going forward. Then, Casey Michel, young journalist, trained at Columbia University, was a student of Alex Cooley, who wrote a fantastic book that came out recently on kleptocracy in a small cluster of Eurasian countries. It just came out about 6 months ago. And Casey traveled at our expense, but only cost a few $100 because traveling within our country isn't too expensive. It's not like going to international conferences and stuff. And he went to South Dakota and Nevada and Wyoming and places like that. And he, beyond Delaware, Nevada, the sort of usual suspects, and uncovered some interesting things about this whole issue of the United States as the leading secrecy jurisdiction. So this was presented yesterday on the Hill with a marvelous introduction by Senator Whitehouse, which confirms Hudson's bipartisan principles, for that matter. And then today, we are going to present money laundering for 21st century authoritarianism. And this actually reflects what we are going to focus on more than anything at the Kleptocracy Initiative now, which is the West's role in enabling kleptocracy, international kleptocracy. What did I just say? Oh my. In other words, our role in providing the punch bowl. I like that term punch bowl, but my wife thinks that I've been using it too long. She doesn't think it's so great. But if one thinks of fraternity parties and things like that, it's not really such a bad analogy, and it's a little denigrating. And we provide the punch bowl for all this. And the other notion of my punch bowl analogy is it's pretty easy to solve this problem if you simply pick up the punch bowl and take it away. I mean, everybody wants to make this stuff so terribly complicated. An aside, little parenthesis. There was recently an article in Foreign Affairs by Thorsten Benner, who runs a think tank in Berlin, and it's called An Era of Authoritarian Influence, and it's a fantastic summary of everything we've done over the last 3.5 years, really. And it shows that there are other people on the other side of the pond and quite a bit going on the subject. It's a great synthesis of what's going on. We may be working with Thorsten on a project going forward. This remains to be seen. Okay, now, what about today's paper? So I will introduce Ben and Melinda, but just also mention how much work went into this. I mean, they interviewed a ton of people, and we had an enormous amount of material that was culled down into this paper. And it's a real think tank paper, in the sense of a lot of original research, and a great deal of thought going into the architecture of it, this, that, and the other. So let me introduce Ben. It's always a pleasure to introduce Ben, and it's very easy because you don't have to sort of fish for qualities or talents or anything like that. If anything, you sort of have to tone things down. And there was a word I wanted to use, actually, at the end of introducing him, but I can't on camera. We're streamed live. These become documents of Hudson Institute. You know, it's not a... there are limits. But anyway, before... Ben is now... I should start with the fact that Ben is now very recently got his visa and is an employee of Hudson Institute as of now, basically. I mean, just the last few days and all of that. And as many of you know, and as you will very much know when he starts speaking, he's from the UK. And when he was 23, he published a book called Fragile Empire, and at age 23. And this was after traveling all over the Russia. So it was very much a journalistic book, but which then went well beyond journalism. And Ben is one of these rare, interesting people who is fundamentally a great journalist. But then he works his way up. He starts with the realities of life, of reportage, works his way up into political thought and into political action, which I'll get to in just a minute. This can be contrasted with, say, a political theorist who starts with theory. And in my role as publisher of the American Interest magazine, I work with a lot of those people, and a very famous one in particular. Then you start with the theory and you sort of work your way down to some engagement with the real world, and when the real world doesn't cooperate with your theory, it can be very annoying. So I have, obviously, as you can see, I have great admiration for Ben and his gifts. So before he came to work with us on a sustained basis here at Hudson, which was his idea, I should add, we had worked on various things together. I think I initially met him via Bill Browder, who's on my advisory council and was one of the early founders almost of the Kleptocracy initiative in a sense. And it was with Ben and some other people, but Ben primarily, that we cooked up these Kleptocracy tours in London, which to my great surprise, the president of Hudson Institute, my boss here, agreed we would officially co-sponsor with the Henry Jackson Society in London, which is also a serious think tank. Serious think tanks sponsoring klepto tours. Well, okay, great. They're still going on. I'm sure many of you have heard what this was about, but these were buses of journalists, basically, and then members of the British government. A lot of people picked up on this. It got a lot of press coverage, going to see the real estate of supposed alleged kleptocrats, the way you sort of go for a Hollywood tour of the stars. And this was so successful, it's continued, and apparently had some influence on Parliament and Cameron on the passage of certain government measures, to use a general term, in the UK. So that was kind of cool. And then Ben was the brains, as I understand it, behind a film called From Russia with Cash that Channel 4 did in the UK. And this also had influence, apparently, real political influence. It was arresting. And we invited Ben and the whole team over for a big US premiere of the film at the museum, which was hugely well attended and which I still hear about. I get feedback about that all the time. In terms of getting back to Ben, his recent work, if you want to see his journalism, he's had some assignments for the Sunday Times, a fantastic profile of Emmanuel Macron, current president of France, where he traveled around with Macron, and I guess his wife was kind of around, so he got to know him a bit. It's a great read. And then more recently, can I mention the name of the recent one, or it hasn't appeared yet? That's not published, so I shouldn't mention anything about that. Yeah, okay. I almost committed a faux pas. Well, that's probably enough on Ben. Melinda Lee, who's over here, would you stand up, Melinda, just so people know who you are if they want to ask a question later or whatever, worked a lot with Ben on this paper, and she even took a little course in anti-money laundering, which I think she passes a test for soon, something like that. And Belinda came to us right out of Pomona College, and she was a star student of Ming-Sing Pei's, the great China expert who was on our advisory council, and she is a fabulous researcher, excellent writer. She's pushy in a good way, which you need to be if you're going to be a really good researcher. And she's also our star manager of interns. I need to take lessons from her as to how you manage interns, because she had a whole bevy of them doing stuff. It was with discipline. It was all quite remarkable. And to complete Belinda, I'm going to talk for the whole time here. I better shut up. Belinda is going to law school. She got into her first choice of law school recently, and so she will unfortunately be leaving us in a few months. Now, just a quick word about the respondent, Raymond Baker. I've known Raymond for 12 years, and Raymond is truly, he's old enough now that one doesn't offend him by mentioning that he's an elder statesman, and he truly is one of a handful of elder statesmen of the, shall we say, anti-illicit financial flows movement. And he wrote the first book, or the first magazine piece. So we could, the first person who brought in one document all the issues surrounding illicit finance together. So everything is in there, and this really, it was really a seminal work. It led to the founding of Global Financial Integrity and to a lot of great things he's done since then. And so the format, Ben is going to present the paper and its ideas, then Raymond will be the respondent. He will also speak from the podium, and then we will all be joined by Brady Olson of the FBI and Gary Kalman, the head of the FACT Coalition, for a discussion. Thank you very much, and sorry for speaking for so long. My apologies. Yep. Ooh.
Well, I'd like to sort of begin firstly by thanking the Hudson Institute and by thanking Charles Davison for such an incredibly kind introduction. I'm really sort of blushing or sort of purring at this point. And I'd also like to especially thank my co-author in this project, Belinda Lee, who did well over half of the thinking, research, and intellectual sort of dynamism to this report. It may seem unusual that the Hudson Institute is doing such a blended research, bringing together ideas of corruption, bringing together journalists, political writers, Englishmen, Frenchmen, but I'd just like to say that actually in the Hudson Institute's heritage, this is very much in keeping. And the Hudson Institute, when it was founded by Herman Kahn, was the think tank that gave a home to the African-American novelist Ralph Ellison, and was the think tank that brought to Washington the great French liberal Léon Aron, and was a home to sort of futurists and people willing to think the unthinkable and to really sort of smash through a lot of the tired ideas of yesterday. When we began this project, shortly after Russia's annexation of Crimea, our sort of motivating idea was that there was a persisting look towards Russia and towards China from the Cold War, which would count their tanks, count their missiles, count their industrial production and pig iron production, but wouldn't think and conceptualize strategically about their money and about financial flows. There was a legacy in the think tank community and in the strategic community of looking at America's America's foes and sometimes partners as if they were not major exporters of financial flows, and as if they had not been able to weaponize and develop strategic tools of their own with their money. And our project has since then been bringing together thinkers from across Europe and the United States and across very different disciplines, from the law, from finance, from investigative journalism and from activism, to work out how to think that through. When our project began, our initial idea was to follow that money. And we saw these financial flows leaving Russia, leaving China, leaving Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, the list can go on, and finding themselves embedded in the Western financial system. And our initial idea was that there is significant leverage not used by the United States and the European Union and, dare I say, Japan, to that could potentially be impacted on these ruling classes. And that idea at the time, which would have seemed quite radical, is now very much part of the new playbook. And we've seen banking sanctions and asset freezes placed on the elites of Russia, Syria, Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea to further American interests over the last 2 years. Since then, with the Kleptocracy curse report that we worked together on, we then moved into investigating that financial system itself. And our research has begun to show that globalization in its current format, rather than being a world that uniquely favors NGOs and Democrats and sort of emerging opposition dissidents and emerging middle classes and a certain view of the Americanization and democratization of the world, was in fact a very friendly environment to the kleptocratic elites of hostile, authoritarian, and more often than not, dictatorial powers at play in world politics, because the contemporary financial system offered to them access to the very best lawyers, the very best bankers, the very best PR artists and consultants of the Western system, allowing these elites to be repressive at home and enjoy the benefits of an authoritarian system in the countries they ruled, but also play with the tools normally and previously only available to democratic elites in the West. As a program, we became fascinated by those around and helping the kleptocrats, by the financiers, by the bankers, by the lawyers, by these consultants. And we began to try and develop a conceptual framework for looking at them. Charles came up with the term enablers, the enablers of kleptocracy, the enablers of dirty finance. And when we began this project, we decided we would begin, in keeping with our fascination with financial flows, with looking at the money. How much money is laundered in the United States every year? Well, that number might shock you, because the number is 300 billion is laundered annually in the United States. Now, 300 billion is a big number. It's very hard to actually even conceive of it. I can't imagine $300 billion lined up in a line on the road. I can't imagine that easily. So let me give you a few more figures to illustrate just how enormous that is. The amount of money laundered in the United States a year is the equivalent to 2% of American GDP. So now we can begin to imagine 2% of American annual output is laundered money, is the proceeds of illegal finance being laundered in this country. Now, what industry would that be comparable to? Well, the industry that our research shows it's comparable to is the US mining industry. So the amount of money laundered in the United States a year is equivalent to the amount of value of the US mining industry a year. So I think that should illustrate just what a gigantic phenomenon money laundering is in this country. We then continued our research from that point. We went to speak to the FBI, we went to speak to the leading specialists, we went to speak to law enforcement, we went to speak to the Department of Homeland Security, we went to speak to members of Congress and people investigating such matters. And the evidence that came out is should really worry Americans, because according to the World Bank, and according to a comprehensive analysis of money laundering cases, this country is the global kleptocrats' favorite location to launder money. Much more popular than Panama, much more popular than Switzerland. The United States is the #1 location to launder money. It's again, because there is still a lack of an inability to think about power as something more than tanks and a game of Risk and missiles in perfect order, it often takes a while for people to realize that money laundering is a crucial part of the power of hostile actors to the United States. So just let me explain with a metaphor that we were told by one of America's sort of leading police authorities investigating this matter. If you're a criminal, you know how to be a criminal. It's not a problem. If you're a successful criminal, you know how to pick ladies' pockets, you know how to sell drugs on the street corner, you know how to loot your country. You're the president of a former Soviet republic. It's not a problem for you to order for the healthcare budget to be under your control. Your problem as a criminal, as a kleptocrat, as the head or one of the leaders of the Sinaloa drug cartel is, how do I launder that money? How do I take this dirty black cash and convert it as quickly as possible into clean white cash that I can then turn into new sources of power and activity? So your problem is, how do I launder my money as quickly and as easily as possible? And the easier it is for you to launder your money, the more powerful you become. The quicker a post-Soviet kleptocrat can move his cash out of the territory he controls and secure it in the West and launder it, the more agents of influence he can bring into his orbit in the United States, in Britain, in the European Union. The quicker what the bosses of the Juarez cartel can launder their money, the more armed men, the more corrupt members of local parliaments and governments they can bring into their orbit. So there is a direct line, there is a mathematical formula, you can call it the kleptocracy rule. The easier it is to launder money, the more powerful criminals and kleptocrats will become. So our research then took us into investigating what systems does the United States have in place to defend itself against money laundering? What do the defenses of this country look like? And this is what our report concentrates on, and we have found some a shocking lack of preparedness, a lack of sophistication, and a lack of robust defenses in this country against this problem. The United States anti-money laundering system, which only got going in the late 20th century, is in some ways the world's most effective 20th century anti-money laundering system. It's designed to bust 1980s flare-wearing cocaine cowboys in Miami with suitcases of cash. It's not designed to deal with iPhone-enabled and digitally banking Russian or Chinese kleptocrats. Now, why is that? What are the flaws of the anti-money laundering system? Now, the first flaw that we found, which is by far and away the most meaningful, is that the anti-money laundering system does not extend meaningfully to the financial services beyond banks that act as gatekeepers to the financial system. It does not meaningfully extend to lawyers. It does not meaningfully extend to incorporation agents or those involved in real estate transactions. Now, at first, you might go, well, finance about banks, isn't it? Money goes through banks. But that's quite a sort of, dare I say, a 20th century way of looking at financial flows, because in the current economic environment in the 21st century, lawyers, incorporation agents, and those involved in real estate transactions are handling significant financial flows and operate in some ways as an alternative non-bank centered financial services system, but they are not meaningfully covered by the American anti-money laundering system. So we have in this country a lopsided system where American blue chip banks, where Wall Street, as it's sometimes known, even though it's much, much bigger than Wall Street, are hiring very large compliance departments, are engaged in major AML form filling, and annually the sector is paying the equivalent for its own compliance department of the budget of the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security combined. But just down the road, just one click away, just one movement away, in the offices of lawyers, incorporation agents, or real estate, those involved in real estate transaction, nothing meaningfully is taking place. We have this very, very lopsided system. We have a bureaucratic wall, and then we have nothing when it comes to dealing with the defenses of America's AML system. The second major flaw that we discovered in our research is that the United States operates as a factory for anonymous shell companies, and that the United States is pumping out annually effectively pieces of paper, or not even pieces of paper, digital imprints, which have the rights of corporations and the ability to navigate of corporations, and offer complete anonymity to their owners and those that will stash money in them. These are not corporations or companies in a meaningful way. They produce no goods and services, but the better way to understand them are anonymity devices being produced by the American incorporation sector. Now, in all of our investigations, we found that the number one tool, obviously, that a money launderer is looking for is the ability to make himself anonymous. And as long as the US system is a factory for anonymous shell companies, it is producing devices that can simply walk through the US anti-money laundering system. The equivalent of the invisibility cloaks of Harry Potter is a way that one of our interviewees put it. Now, what is going on in the software of the anti-money laundering system that exists? Anyone who's worked in finance will know that you are supposed to file a suspicious activity report when a sort of suspicious individual with suspicious cash that you suspect of being a money launderer wanders into your bank or wanders into your client department looking to place money. Now, the SARs, these operate in the wrong way around. An individual is obliged to file a SAR, but once he's done that, it is simply logged on a system. It's just a log. It's not a preventative system. And only when, via another mechanism, a crime has been reported, is that system usually and typically consulted. And now, the final major flaw we found with the US anti-money laundering system is capacity and conviction rates. Now, we're talking about 300 billion a year. We're not talking about nothing. We're talking about an industry the size and an industry of enablers of money laundering who are producing output equivalent to the US mining industry, but we're only talking about 2,000 convictions a year. We're talking about a less than 5% conviction rate. Now, just to put that in perspective, in case the 300 billion wasn't perspective enough, 55,000 suspicious activity reports are filed a day, but only 2,000 individuals are being convicted a year. Now, our research then took us further into trying to work out what the loopholes were in the existing financial system that were offered by enablers. And on our visits to Miami and to New York and to London, we found that lawyers and bankers and those engaged in corporation agents and real estate transactions were often knowingly offering these services. Now, one of the first loopholes we found was that it's very easy to circumvent what are known as politically exposed persons regulations. It's very narrowly defined. An individual who's a politically exposed person with extra regulation placed on them. Often family members are used instead. We found the same problem of anonymous companies being able to stand in instead. We found that lawyers' accounts, IOLTA accounts, are a sort of backdoor into the US financial system, and that money can be placed in them by foreign actors and potentially foreign kleptocrats without meaningful checks. And this is a world which is of over 400 billion, where over $400 billion is sort of circulating a year. And to come back to what may be an old chestnut to visitors of the Hudson Institute, we found that the persistent lack to close the loopholes that permit one to buy property anonymously in this country continues to turn, despite effort made by FinCEN with its geographical targeting orders, continues to turn luxury real estate in America's most exclusive and often not cities into the bitcoins of kleptocrats. Now, what should be done about such a major problem? Now, how should one go about fixing this? So, at first, we brainstormed about, would it be a standalone piece of legislation? Could we develop a piece of super legislation that would fix the problem? But studying from political campaigns of the past, we have found that these tend not to be successful without a meaningful and long-term effort to educate and to use an expression favored by Charles, to infect sort of lawmakers and the sort of Washington the Washington political framework, so to speak, with viral ideas. One idea that we have, which we think could be a great way to push policy going forward, is that right now in Congress, we have a series of overlapping initiatives inspired by the growing power of drug cartels and the growing menace of deaths caused by them in the United States, and the fear of Russian interference and weaponized dirty money in this country, to remove the capacity to create anonymous companies, to create registers of who actually owns them. Instead of having whilst these are all fantastic, we think that a way to go beyond that would be to establish a joint special committee of Congress on kleptocracy to examine the issue in breadth and in depth, and to work out, sitting regularly over years, how to create a real 21st century anti-money laundering system. And we believe this should be twinned with a kleptocracy study group, in the same way that you have a Europe study group or you have a Japan study group, where members of Congress can engage in close and regular and structured cooperation with America's allies, like Britain or Ukraine or France, to work out how these countries are making strides in defending themselves against kleptocracy. Just to conclude, I'd like to bring back this issue of conceptualizing defenses. And there is such an enormous conversation here. There is such enormous investment and such an enormous desire to protect the country's borders. This could be walls. It could be extraordinary air forces. It could be the long-term dream ardently pursued of a missile defense shield. But in the 21st century, in the internet age, in a financialized age, America also needs to realize that defenses have to exist within the financial system against dirty money and against especially weaponized dirty money and financial flows from hostile actors. And just before I open I pass the floor to Raymond Baker, there's one final point here about money and its transformative power. So at the beginning of this century, it was believed that globalization was a pretty one-way street, that America and the European Union would export cash, export money, export ideas, and that would transform the political elites of Russia and China and India and Paraguay into becoming more Western. But what we've noticed, whereas there is undeniably a bit of that, there's also flows coming the other way that can transform elites that become their enablers into looking more like the exporters of kleptocratic capital. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoy reading the report.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Ben. I'm delighted to be here this morning with you, participating in the Kleptocracy Initiative's launch of this report. As I was walking over here this morning, I was recalling a breakfast that Charles and I had several years ago, at the conclusion of which Charles said, "Raymond, you are the most straightforward person that I know." And I thought to myself, that's a nice comment. Until I thought about it 2 or 3 days later, and I realized that what Charles really meant was, "Raymond, you are the least diplomatic person I know." I will try to be on my best behavior today. Let me be slightly autobiographical. In 1990, I started asking myself a question. How do you solve a problem that no one wants to solve? And that problem that I was thinking about was dirty money flowing around the world, producing poverty and insecurity for billions of people. My own book, when it was published in 2005, I had no idea at that moment whether there would be a single other person in the world that would agree with what I was saying. Fortunately, many people agreed, and now we have a great many people focused on this massive, multifaceted global problem. Ben and Melinda, this is an excellent piece of work. Thank you so much for this. What you're doing in this paper, and what the Kleptocracy Initiative is doing, is taking this whole issue of illicit money and focusing it on security concerns. As long as this issue was primarily focused on corruption and drugs and trafficking and so forth, the national security community could say, oh, that's the soft side of international affairs. We in the national security community, we deal on the hard stuff, military matters and diplomacy and foreign policy. Kleptocracy Initiative is saying, no, the soft side, as you call it, is in fact making it impossible for you to achieve what you're trying to achieve in what you call the hard side, achieving peace and security. Illicit money is a key component in our inability to achieve many of our diplomatic and foreign policy and military objectives. I want to make 3 fundamental points, and then I'll go on and talk about a few aspects of the report itself. First of all, as many of you know, the scope of the shadow financial system that moves illicit money comprises tax havens, secrecy jurisdictions, disguised corporations, anonymous trust accounts, fake foundations, money laundering techniques of various iterations. Trade misinvoicing is, in our analysis, the mechanism that moves more illicit money across borders than any other mechanism. And then there's the structure of lawyers and bankers and accountants that operate the system. And then finally, there are holes quite intentionally left in our laws to facilitate the movement of money out of other countries, across borders, through the shadow financial system, and ultimately into our own economies. The development of this system got underway in earnest in the 1960s. And over the decades, this same system has been stepped into and utilized by drug dealers and other criminals and corrupt government officials and terrorists. And now, as we are focusing on kleptocrats, they've been around in the developing countries for some time, but not until it began to affect the larger powers have we focused on that. Every element of the shadow financial system was created by us. This is not something done to us. This is something done by us. We continue to hold on to the shadow financial system because we use it. We use the system to move aspects of our money, particularly corporations moving revenues and profits across borders in ways that avoid monitoring and avoid payment of taxes or the avoidance of taxes. Every multinational, multi-billion-dollar, multi-product corporation that I know of uses aspects of the shadow financial system in some parts of their operations. The key fallacy in global anti-money laundering efforts is the idea that we can hold on to our use of this system while at the same time making other people give up their use of the system. This is not possible. We have to recognize that we are dealing with a systemic problem that requires a systemic solution. Second point that I want to make is, in fact, illustrative of the first point. My favorite organization in Washington to criticize is the Drug Enforcement Administration. Created in 1973, now in business for 44 years, the Drug Enforcement Administration has not succeeded in curtailing the supply of drugs or raising the price of drugs. Don't get me wrong, I have enormous respect for agents who put themselves on the line going after drugs and cartels. What I don't respect is the mandate that they are given, which is to concentrate on the product rather than the money. United Nations Office of Drugs and Crimes estimates that globally some 40% of hard drugs are interdicted somewhere between production and consumption. 40% interdiction of those drugs. They also estimate that less than 1% of drug proceeds are ever recovered. 40% of the product is stopped, less than 1% of the drug money is ever received. Drug kingpins can afford to lose 50% or 60% or 70% or more of the product if they can keep more than 99% of the money. DEA, in my judgment, is making a fundamental mistake in concentrating on the product rather than on the money. We had an ex-DEA agent in our office not long ago, and we asked him, what percentage of the agents are focused on the product and what percentage are focused on the money? He said 90% are focused on the product. As long as that is the case, it is my view that we will continue to be unsuccessful in trying to solve the drug problem. The fact that we have not curtailed the supply of drugs nor raised the price of drugs over a period of 44 years is in my judgment the definition of failure. I have asked in talks I've given at various places around the world, how do you curtail the supply of something that is in endless supply? How do you do that? Drugs are in endless supply. The answer is you don't focus on the supply, you focus on the money. This is what Louise Shelley said here a couple of weeks ago. Focus on the money. Third point I want to make is dismantling the shadow financial system is a matter of political will. This is not rocket science. I make this point because a lot of people will say the opposite. A lot of people will say, oh, this is terribly difficult stuff. You don't understand how technically complicated it is to do this. I disagree with that. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Shell banks. Shell banks used to be included in that recitation of elements of the shadow financial system that I talked about. But I don't include it any longer, because in the USA Patriot Act, shell banks were taken off the table just like that. The USA Patriot Act says it is illegal for any U.S. financial institution to receive money from a foreign shell bank. It goes on to say it is illegal for any other financial institution in the world to send money to the United States that it has received from a foreign shell bank. It makes it clear that this also pertains to wire transfers that might touch a correspondent banking account in New York City before flitting off somewhere else. Immediately when the Patriot Act was put into force, shell banks began to dry up around the world. There's still a handful left in Europe and Asia, but basically I don't include shell banks any longer in as a significant factor in the shadow financial system. This was accomplished with political will by some very key senators, and there was no tortured law enforcement process that was gone through. In the same way, every element of the shadow financial system can be curtailed if we have the political will to do so. So, three fundamental points. We created the shadow financial system. It is severely harming us in a multitude of ways. Dismantling this system is a matter of political will. Now let me comment on two or three aspects within the report itself. Ben and Melinda, you quote the Treasury Department estimating that $300 billion a year is laundered through the United States. 20 years ago, I asked the director of FinCEN what was his estimate. At that time, he said $250 billion. I then asked him, how much of that money do we capture, do we get our hands on? He said, oh, in a good year, we might get our hands on 250 million. I did a quick calculation. 99.9% of the laundered money gets into the United States. 0.1% do we ever get our hands on. In other words, our anti-money laundering efforts are within a single decimal place of being totally ineffective. At a point in your report, you talk about plausible deniability. I have asked compliance officers in many banks in the United States and in other banks around the world, what's the purpose of your anti-money laundering programs and efforts? And if you get their confidence or get a drink or two in them, I have found many of them will admit this is about plausible deniability. This is about being able to say when found to have laundered money in your institution. This is about saying we've got good systems in place. This transaction got through us. We'll strengthen our procedures going forward. We'll do better next time. And then they'll go right back to doing the same thing they've been doing. Plausible deniability is the way that we are operating our anti-money laundering efforts. The next point I want to refer to in the report itself, you have raised the question of outside verification of beneficial ownership of companies and bank accounts. I don't think we've yet done enough to require banks to go the extra mile in accomplishing identification of beneficial ownership. If I was a bank president, I would have a letter sent out to all of my account holders saying, you've got 6 months to tell me who are the natural persons owning this, down to whatever percentage level I choose, and I might choose 5% or 2% or whatever, and the people that are authorized to operate the account. If we don't have this information in 6 months, we will freeze the account. Furthermore, be advised that if we find in the future that the information we have been given is wrong, we will likewise freeze the account. The effect of that will be people who do not want to identify the beneficial ownership of their accounts will take their money elsewhere, which is exactly what I want them to do. I want them to take it out of my bank, go someplace else with it. We haven't gone that far yet in requiring such efforts of banks. Another point, I would hope that in your ongoing work on this issue, there would be a considerable amount of emphasis on the qualified intermediary program. The QI program was set up to enable foreign banks to vet money before it came to the United States. There are now, the last I read, some 7,000 banks that are qualified under the QI program. I think it's quite clear that many of those banks do not do a good job of vetting the money that they are sending to the United States for deposit. I have always regarded the QI program as it was in its early stages. The way that it was operated, it was basically the legalization of laundered money coming into the United States. We washed our hands of the vetting of it. We depended on somebody else. Final point that I want to make is the quote that you have toward the end of the report. We're dealing with a chronic lack of general awareness about the issue and how it connects to national security. Making this connection is the major challenge for the Kleptocracy initiative. Superb work. Congratulations.
We'll bring up our panel now. So everyone to the stage, thank you. And all right, and as moderator, I will say very little after my overly long introduction. So we have 26 minutes left. So Brady Olson of the FBI and Gary Kalman on the end, who is the executive director of the Fact Coalition. Did I get your title right? Are going to say what they have to say for not about 5 minutes or less or a little more, and then we'll have a little bit of time for a discussion. Brady, do you want to kick it off?
Certainly. One of the things that strikes me about some of the comments that were already made was some of the connection to national security when this comes in. And there's already been some discussion that a lot of this is enabling kleptocracy or enabling kleptocrats to conduct authoritarianism in their countries and things like that. But where I come in, and I believe why I'm here, is to sort of help make that connection to national security, like why it's important to us, and how it's enabling threats to national security, as Mr. Baker was talking about, that it goes beyond the hard power national security into, well, we don't care about the money laundering because that's not really affecting national security, but I believe it's the underlying thing that is enabling threats to our national security in the United States. One of the first points I'd like to say is that beyond just a methodology of sheltering or obscuring the financial resources of kleptocrats or other criminal elements transnationally, I think one of the important things is it is an enabler to the threats here in the United States. And for instance, one of the most pertinent examples recently is Russia's use of informational warfare. As you've all seen in the news multiple times, such as the ad buys for Twitter and Facebook and that sort of thing, and how that's been enabled through illicit cash flows into the United States and the purchases of those ad buys. So for the FBI, one of the difficult things, speaking from Mr. Baker's comment about how the DEA's focus has always been curtailing the product rather than going after the money. Well, in this situation for the FBI, it brings the challenge home to us that we can't curtail the product. The product is information, and the FBI shouldn't be in the business of throttling or censoring the internet or freedom of speech. A lot of this is sort of a viral nature where it starts from a bad actor, but then this is everyday American citizens that catch on to it and it goes viral. So we can't curtail that product. That would in and of itself be authoritarianism, and that's not the FBI's place and shouldn't be our place. So where we would come in is on the attribution of the problem. Like, we need to show who's behind it and that sort of thing. So for us, the only method, the only way to go after it is to show the financial connections. So it really brings the importance of this home for us as the FBI. And last thing I want to talk about on that note is that it's important for us to also increase media literacy in general, and there's also the misunderstanding and a fallacy that that the internet, that the actors behind this are organic to the United States, and there's not. The way that Russia views it is in this hybrid warfare, like Mr. Zaslavsky's piece that you guys published, in that Russia views the battlefield as a hybrid battlefield across all methods: hard power, soft power, foreign influence, anything like that is all the way it's seen. But for us to see it from the United States perspective, that it's all about counting tanks and missiles and things like that, and we don't need to worry about the money, and it doesn't affect national security, but it does, and some of the recent problems have really brought that to light. So I appreciate being here, and I think it's a really good topic.
Great. A few short, brief comments, and then get to questions. But first, do want to thank the Hudson Institute for having this and for the work that they've put into this issue. It has truly elevated the issue in ways that we did not imagine several years ago. In fact, I'm honored to be on this panel. Raymond put out his book 2005, you said? Yeah. The first bill on beneficial ownership was introduced in 2006. And so the folks that are here and talking about this issue have done a lot of the work in uncovering and making sure that people understand the depth and the issues that are very serious that we're dealing with. So first, just a big thanks to that. I do want to say that just to agree with my colleagues here that it should be about following the money. There are very few, if any, criminals that do it because they philosophically believe in the crime. I don't think that there's drug dealers peddling drugs because they philosophically believe everybody should have drugs. It is about the money, and so let's focus on what is the motivation and go after the motivation. And so following the money and reorganizing ourselves to do that, I think, is the way in which we begin to make any serious progress on this issue. The other thing I wanted to pick up on was this isn't complicated. Been doing a lot of work on financial issues for many, many years, and every issue, whether you're in the, protecting consumers around financial issues or larger issues around global finance, it's always complicated. The people who don't want you to make progress are going to talk about, that's all cute and nice what you're saying, but you really don't understand. Those of us that are in the business, we're the only ones that understand. We're the only ones that can solve the problem, and yet the problem does not get solved. We have been focused in the FACT Coalition on pushing a bill to get beneficial ownership information collected, make it available to law enforcement and those in the financial services community that we empower and ask to deal with the money laundering issue. It is one step. We understand it's not the be-all and end-all step, but we believe it is a foundational step before we can move on to other issues. We have been told numerous times that the bill that we are promoting is very complex. There is no way to know who owns a company. And it would be a significant burden. And I kid you not, that there are multiple trade groups in this town that have sent pleading letters to Congress, don't do this, because putting someone's name and address on a piece of paper is so burdensome, it is going to reduce capital formation in this country and kill jobs. We disagree. The last thing I would say is that we need to make sure that we get this right. I think Raymond is right to say that we create some of these laws and they're either purposefully have loopholes or unexpected loopholes. I'm not going to assign motive to people right now, but the issue is that we need to get this right. And so let me give two quick things. One is we are battling whether or not and how you define beneficial owner. You would think that that would be a simple thing. It's the person who controls the company. That phrase, control the company, is so confusing that no one knows how to deal with it, and we've gotten pushback on that. And yet, if you take that out, then you end up with a situation which was uncovered by the Panama Papers last year, where they allowed people who weren't ultimately in control to sign the papers, and so you had an employee of Mossack Fonseca, the law firm in Panama, where one employee, one woman, was the owner, director, manager, whatever the form required, for 20,000 companies. Now, either she's the most efficient person in the world, or there's something nefarious going on behind that. Last thing I'm going to say is the gatekeepers. And this is where the report, I think, really is important to be pointing out that we need to take a closer look at the gatekeepers who are allowing the money into the system. And we've been going back and forth with a number in the Bar Association and lawyer groups that represent lawyers saying, they have their own guidelines, they have their standards, and that should be good enough. We don't need laws coming in. Our lawyers know what to do, and they're monitoring the system. Two things I would say on that. One is that because they're voluntary, it's questionable about how effective they can be. And then the evidence would suggest that while even if those are good faith efforts, and I will give our friends in the legal community a benefit of a doubt on this, that was a good faith effort to come up. It's very comprehensive, I would say, and if you look at it on its face, it looks good. Sadly, however, it has failed. And there's two things I would say. One is Global Witness, one of our coalition partners, went on a sort of undercover investigation, and they went into 13 random law firms in the United States. 12 of the 13 law firms that they went in, having someone pose as a corrupt foreign official, or representing a corrupt foreign official, where they want to move money into the United States, clearly sketchy. 12 out of the 13 said, oh, here's how I would do it, and they would use anonymous shell companies. One lawyer said, this is not for me. That does not, now that's not a full representative sample, I understand, but it doesn't bode well for the profession. The other thing is that there were picking up on the World Bank saying that we are the place to be if you're a kleptocrat. The reason is that it's the easiest place in the world, according to a study by UT Austin professors and BYU professors, to set up an anonymous shell company. They sent out thousands, tens of thousands of notices around the world and found that the United States is the easiest place to set up an anonymous shell company and move dirty money into it. There was one lawyer in Florida, and I point this out not because it's defining, but I thought it was illustrative of the rest of the report, who literally wrote back to the professors and said, this is clearly dirty money. It could even be terror financing. I won't touch it for less than $5,000 a month. So I'll end on that note. Happy to do questions, but clearly we need to make some changes, and happy to be part of this group that has been doing such great work.
All right. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Brittany. Well, I think this was, a very interesting panel. We've got very different pieces and constituents here. A final point from Ben, and then we'll move to Q&A since we don't have a lot of
just
time.
one final point about conceptualizing the enemy and about conceptualizing the sort of sort of field of combat. I think there's like a very restricted and outdated 20th century view of imagining the sort of field of combat as uniquely being. Sorry? Sure, you're just making some little gestures there.
They're eager to ask questions.
I mean, there's a very outdated sort of view of imagining the field of combat as uniquely being a military battlefield or uniquely being a propaganda battlefield. And on those terrains, the enormous size and existing military infrastructure and defensive infrastructure of the United States can be deployed to massive advantage against Russia or Turkey or so on. But if you have no defenses in the financial system and you allow kleptocrats to simply walk in to your financial system, which means they can walk into your political system, you create a field, you are now a new field of combat to emerge. And if you have created a situation where foreign kleptocrats can simply fight American oligarchs, it nullifies, in Washington, it nullifies the amazing strategic advantage of having all those existing scientific and military defenses.
I think that's an absolutely key point. Beautiful way to end our formal presentation of this all. And I might just say, this will truly be short a sentence or two, that Raymond Baker, whom we have with us, is a graduate of Harvard Business School and was the teaching assistant to arguably the most prestigious and influential professor in the history of Harvard Business School. So when one thinks of these issues as coming from different elements of our citizenry going against this stuff, this isn't the lefty NGO world, some kid who's never had a real job who thinks they can improve the world with the depth of their wisdom. This is coming from a very, very different place in our society. So the gentleman all the way on the end, please, first, and then we'll go to the enthusiastic man in the blue tie.
Ian Talley, Wall Street Journal. Two questions. One, on beneficial ownership, why would you restrict it to only law enforcement and banks when you can utilize the whole, it's kind of like saying, let's have one mainframe computer rather than use cloud computing to effectively use the entire system to process beneficial ownership transactions. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Very much so.
So I think of C4ADS pointing out interactions with China and North Korea that the government hadn't been able to process. I think of Bellingcat being able to process public access information about where Russian positions were in Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. So secondly, in dealing with this concept of the fighting an old fight, are we not missing out of this discussion the VC, virtual currency, which would in the coding be able to trace back all of the beneficial owners if one is to be able to proactively get a hold ahead of the sort of regulatory question about who holds the key to the VC. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yep, we got it. Okay, who wants to? Yeah.
So to answer the first question, in a word, politics. So I couldn't agree with you more. My coalition has pushed for actually public registries, which is not unprecedented. In fact, the UK now has a registry of beneficial owners of companies. About 1.6 million companies in 6 months signed up for it. 98% said they had no problem identifying their owner. There were a couple that had some questions. The registry is online. It is available to the public, so everyone can look at it and use it. There has not been problems. We would love to see that in the United States. The problem that we've faced is folks raising concerns about the privacy of companies, about who's behind the company, and so the bill has been fashioned to limit who has access. We've been fighting for greater access, and we couldn't agree with you more.
Brady, do you want to comment on the other?
Certainly. Some of the things about virtual currency, cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, that sort of thing. I remember I had a discussion with Charles, it was several months ago, so sort of ancient history as it goes with Bitcoin. And the discussion was sort of how much do we think or how much do we see money laundering occurring through some of the cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin being the biggest or largest one. And at the time I remember saying, due to the nature of cryptocurrency or Bitcoin, how it's capped at a certain amount and it's sort of controlled, I posited at the time that there's not a whole lot of large-scale money laundering going on through that. Like you look at, there was a great New Yorker piece on like mirror trading and things like that where they're doing 10 million, $100 million transactions where it's massive amounts of money. So to do something like that in Bitcoin is difficult because number one, it would change the price of Bitcoin doing such a massive transaction like that. And secondly, it's not as liquid as you would like something to be when you're trying to move massive amounts of money. So at the time I said it's probably not happening. And then as we've seen recently, Bitcoin's skyrocketing. I think it's nearly $10,000 a Bitcoin now, where it was just a couple $100 when we had this discussion previously. That I think there is some movement into cryptocurrencies now and virtual currencies. And I think it's starting to pick up that some of the large scale transactions are starting to hit across some of those. And that's obviously an altogether different problem set that we're probably already behind again as well.
You wanted to make a brief comment, Ben, before we move on, or?
Just a comment on the British legislation. It's actually register of persons of significant control because obviously persons of significant control over a company can be sometimes in no way linked to the legal title deed. So it's actually broader than simply beneficial owners. And I would love such a system to exist. It's worth remembering that some European countries are really light years ahead of the current murky situation in the United States. For instance, in Norway, anyone can look at anyone's tax returns online. But the one condition is that the person whose tax returns is being looked at gets the right to know who was looking at his.
Anders Åslund from the Atlantic Council. First of all, let me congratulate Ben and Melinda on this report that really looks excellent, and Charles for running this initiative. I think that this is enormously important. And particularly I appreciate the quantifications, that you emphasize how much money it is, and we should really get more of these numbers out. My question concerns how do we most effectively attack it. And I think that Raymond had an excellent example with the Patriot Act having cleaned out the shadow banking system, shell bank system in no time. Can't we do the same with, you mentioned, Ben, the three categories, law firms. It's absurd that law firms can take money at all. And the real estate sector and the corporation agencies. Can't we just say that normal bank regulation should apply to all financial transactions? Isn't that possible, international transactions? Isn't that possible to do? That would be one simple law that could be adopted. What do you say generally on the panel? Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to start with that, Raymond?
Yes, let me touch on both the beneficial ownership question and the question of law firms. Let's all be clear that the U.S. Treasury Department could, if it chose, require all banks to know the beneficial ownership of every account in the bank down to a very low level if it chose to do so. The law that it put into place has loopholes, and as I recall, only goes down 25% the level of shareholding. It does not require legislation. The Treasury Department can do this, can impose those requirements on banks just like that if they choose to do so. Law firms, in my view, of course, they should be obligated to be, and I'm not persuaded by the argument of attorney-client privilege. I keynoted a conference in Africa recently by the Pan-African Lawyers Union, and one of the questions circulating there was the adoption of an anti-corruption commitment on the part of African lawyers. And the question was, what do we do if a corrupt person comes to us and asks for defense? Do we take their money? Okay, everybody's entitled to a defense, but by the same token, lawyers in the United States should be subjected to much clear-cut regulation.
Very quickly. Yeah.
Very quickly, just in the U.S. Patriot Act, just so folks know, the requirements for knowing your customer and doing some due diligence were actually broader. For example, it did include the real estate industry. So when it passed, it included the real estate industry, and then within 6 months, I think it was maybe a year, they got an exemption, a temporary exemption that is now, when did the Patriot Act pass? 2002? So 2001. So it is a temporary exemption that is now going into its 17th year. They could just remove the temporary exemption and then they would be covered. So there are legal mechanisms for making this happen. It's more the political will.
You wanted to make a brief comment?
Yeah, just a brief comment, which is, well, yes, of course we could, but and I would love nothing more to see these simple extensions. But just walking through the Senate building yesterday, I must admit, I just felt incredible despondency and despair reading about what's happening in the US tax bill, which will make all of these problems significantly worse. And watching a former party of government in such a state of oligarchic capture that it is unable to even act as a functioning government party. And if one thinks of previous historical moments, one is left thinking about the inability to reform in the Ottoman Empire. One's left with thinking of the inability to reform of the Mughal Empire, when political systems became completely hijacked by sort of elite groups and elite existing investments, which had no interest in the sort of greater benefits of the population or innovation and in reform. And as one knows, anybody who reads the newspaper knows that the future belongs to the countries that develop AI or gene editing or electric vehicles first. And watching the complete absence of any discussion of that in this city, when we don't know where those industries can be concentrated, they can be concentrated anywhere, is really depressing.
Question over here.
Yeah. Hi, good morning. My name is Frank Vogel. A little comment and a question, a very tiny comment. Would you please try in future to add auction houses to your list of enablers?
Yes.
I keep on asking that at all these kinds of sessions, and nobody ever does, so that's my little plea. Okay, my question to Ben and to Raymond Baker. Numbers. You've quoted the 300 billion figure, which comes from a US Treasury report, if I remember rightly, of about 2 years ago, and I have not seen, maybe I'm wrong, and I haven't seen an updated figure from them since. If I think about that number of 300 billion, and I think about where could the kleptocrats and the tax evaders and all the rest of it really deposit very large amounts of money safely, flexibly, and with liquidity, the US obviously is the very first place, the UK is next, and then we have some difficulties in finding really who's third, perhaps France or Germany. The Swiss, after all, are intermediaries to a large extent. So my question is, we have over $1 trillion of illicit finance reported by Global Financial Integrity. We only have 1/3 of that reported for being in the US. Can't we get better numbers? Can't we really just create a table of where we think the illicit finance ultimately ends up? Not in Caymans and British Virgin Islands, but where does it really end up? Does half of it come to the US? Is it only $1 trillion? Is it more? Et cetera, et cetera. Because it seems to me these figures could be extremely powerful.
An answer to that, which is, I was recently at the Treasury in London talking about the nature of this data and gathering this data, and they told me that there is a very large percentage of the cash flows in and out of the United Kingdom that they actually can't work out what it is. And it's not because it's illicit finance, it could be illicit finance, it's incredibly difficult to make those numbers, and we just lack the integrated software to do it. The obvious answer is you have to pay for it. And when you see the IRS being destroyed, when you see the incredibly small amounts of manpower placed in these in the organisations that's supposed to tackle it. Yeah, of course, it's only one figure. It's only 2 years old. One way, because this is how the system works here, is to try and see if you can trigger some interest to get the lavish American defense budget to dedicate 2 minutes of its time into calculating those figures. You know, when they have such extensive research budgets.
Well, one of the nice, we're going to take one last question from our rival American Enterprise Institute. But actually, just in terms of what Ben just mentioned before we get to AEI, there's a huge amount of interest at DOD in this whole issue of illicit finance, illicit financial flows, and corruption, especially grand corruption in countries such as Afghanistan that we've tried to help, and vis-a-vis our ally, we're trying to fix Ukraine, and et cetera. So I don't know if there's anybody today here from DOD, but our events and our activities, we intersect with DOD personnel quite a bit, and really across the spectrum of our government. FBI, many people from there that we're in contact with, and so we're very heartened by the state of affairs with our government. So, AEI. We only need your name now.
Clay Fuller. Great report. Think this is very important work. Broader question sort of on political will and national security and sort of framing for all of this. It's a question I frequently ask. Is there such a thing as an authoritarian regime that is not kleptocratic? Right? And is this kleptocracy idea sort of the new communism? Right, and so the question for national security, right, is where does democracy promotion fit into all of this discussion and work?
Well, ISIS, primary purpose of that is not a kleptocracy. Primary vision of that authoritarian regime was sort of genocidal, millenarial sort of caliphate. You know, and I don't. Yeah, I think like what it, you know, there's obviously kleptocratic elements of it, but in terms of like what is its primary characteristic, I wouldn't call it primarily a kleptocracy. Don't agree with that.
Yeah, ready?
Just to briefly address the political will and national security kind of thing. From my perspective, the political will is sort of an ebb and flow when it comes to national security, and certainly even for something like this, whether we want to tackle the problem of non-attributable companies and illicit cash flows and things like that. From my perspective, it's always kind of been find ways to do more with less, and looking at ways we can use the data out there. I mean, there's incredibly powerful tools that are available to law enforcement that, for instance, like trying to look at ways to leverage some of the correspondent banking relationships where we can look at international flows a little more under sort of a big data lens and things like that, and identifying some of that stuff. So for me, it's never about political will. It's always about getting to the bottom of the problem and protecting national security with whatever tools we have. I'm under no illusions that, you know, some new great bill will give us these brilliant tools and we'll shut down global money laundering and close the door on the West to kleptocrats and illicit financing. So it's more about trying to do what we can with what we have, and if new things come online, it's great.
Most authoritarian regimes gravitate into the use of illicit financial flows to send money out. I've been in almost 100 countries. The only one that I know of that didn't move, the only one that comes to mind immediately is Singapore, which hasn't been particularly corrupt. But certainly most authoritarian regimes gravitate toward extensive flows of illicit money out. Frank, our estimate of $1 trillion a year is based only on the emerging market and developing countries, money going illicitly out. And much of that is trade misinvoicing, which simply disappears into corporate balance sheets and income statements, and you can't identify it very easily.
Well, I'm afraid we have to stop here. I apologize that there wasn't more time for Q&A, but we are around, so by all means, stick around. We'll be here for a while, and thank you for coming.
Good show.